We are live. Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to my channel. What I would like to discuss today is the geopolitics of Europe. And it's worth beginning with a discussion of what that actually means. Because, okay, probably most of you are acquainted with what geopolitics means. It is the study of the way in which geography influences, not only influences, but rather dictates politics, rather international affairs, relations between countries. And it is not so well regarded, not so much studied after the Second World War in the Anglosphere, in the, let's say, collective West, because a rival school of interpretation has risen ever since the United States became hegemonic, and that's the liberal school. It is a values school. It is based on the idea, erroneous in my opinion, that international relations are dictated and should be dictated by whether or not the countries in question are democratic or not. Democratic in the sense that the United States recognizes them as such. Um, Liberal, also in the sense that they might be regarded as such by the propaganda of the collective West. So, yeah, this rather realist approach has been marginalized ever since the advent of the hegemony of the United States. However, what's more interesting to discuss is the concept of Europe. Now, us being rather part of the Western sphere of ideas, the Western approaching this concept with a Western lens, we are less accustomed to actually thinking what Europe is, geographically speaking. And if you go by the definition, you'll be surprised to see that Europe actually ends at the Ural Mountains and at the Ural River and at the Caucasus Mountains, and therefore it encompasses a huge area which is outside the European Union. We tend to think in these terms that Europe is united. It is this entity, this political entity, which has its headquarters in Brussels. However, if you look at the surface area of the countries that are not members of the European Union, you'll be surprised that it is greater than the surface area of the countries which are members of the European Union and which are thus part of the American sphere of influence. So only if you take the countries which are descendants of the Kievan Rus, so of the first state of the Eastern Slavs, and that would be the European part of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. If you add up the surface areas of these countries, you'll be surprised to notice that it is exactly half the surface of Europe. So actually, there is an Eastern Europe which starts at Brest and at Lviv, and a Western Europe which starts on the, yeah, basically the dividing line is the Polish Belarusian border, or the Polish Ukrainian border, essentially where the Eastern Orthodoxy, the Eastern Slavs begin. This is where Eastern Europe begins, and it is a quite sizable part of Europe. I mean, it is exactly half of the European continent. If Ukraine becomes reunited with Russia, politically speaking, one way or another, perhaps in the same manner that Belarus is united with Russia through the Union State or some other configuration, we will have a political entity in Europe. And I don't mean taking into account the Asian part of Russia, just the European part of Russia. The European part of Russia, together with Ukraine and Belarus, make up half the surface area of Europe. So in the case that those three countries become united again, as they were in the times of the Kievan Rus and of the Russian Empire and of the Soviet Union, then we would have a political entity which would encompass, just in Europe, half of the continent. And if you add to that well, you can add basically anything, because if it's half, then whatever is greater than half is the majority, right? So if you add to that, I don't know, Serbia, just as a country that's not a member of the European Union nor a member of NATO, you already have something that makes up the majority of the European landmass, and which is greater than the remainder, which is part of NATO and of the European Union. So therefore, when people regard Europe as a rather Western concept or as part of the American Dominion, they don't actually refer to the entirety of the continent. They just refer to what's politically aligned to the West, even though the sizable part of the continent is rather aligned with Russia, or will be by the time that the Ukraine war is finished. So yeah, it's something worth thinking about. And the whole concept of Europe is not exactly a Western one, given that the whole history of Europe, the development of Europe as a cultural region, took place in the East. Took place in the South, first of all, with the Roman Empire. Well, first we had the Greek civilization, of course, as the first European civilization. We had outposts of civilization in Europe through the Phoenicians, of course, through the Phoenicians having colonies all around the Mediterranean, but they were from the Levant, so they were from Western Asia. The first European civilization, which also gave the name to the continent, baptized Europe with its current name, is the Greek one. And it's hard to say that it is a Western civilization. Of course, the Greeks laid the foundations of Western thought, which is absolutely true. But in terms of polities, in terms of political entities, the Greeks rather laid the foundations of some Eastern states. So after the Great Schism, first of all, after the Roman Empire broke into two pieces and the western part fell, the descendants of civilization were the Greeks again. And the Byzantine Empire was a Greek polity, a Greek-speaking entity. Even though they called themselves Romans, they called themselves Romans in Greek. And after the Great Schism, after Rome had become rather a Germanic, Romanic entity, the capital of a Germanic Europe, spiritually speaking, after the Great Schism of 1066, it wasn't 1066, that's the Battle of Hastings. It was in 1054. My bad, sorry about that. So yeah, after Europe divided confessionally, after Christianity in Europe divided itself on a confessional basis, as it remains divided until today, from that point onwards, the Greeks developed a whole different type of political entities in Eastern Europe, very different from those that were taking hold in Western Europe. So, in a sense, the Russian entity, the Kievan Rus, as well as the Bulgarian political entity, the Tsardoms of the first and second Tsardoms of Bulgaria, they were political entities of Byzantium. They were Orthodox, and also the Slavonic language is to some extent a product of Byzantium. Some Byzantine monks took the task of creating a language of liturgy for the Slavs, and so this whole Eastern civilization, which we now regard as Eastern, being Christian Orthodox as a main pillar of its identity, this is a product of the Greeks, who were the first European civilization, who gave birth to Eastern and Western civilization in Europe at the same time, but having a stronger legacy in Eastern Europe, I would say. Anyway, so yeah, we are not accustomed to thinking in these terms about Europe. The fact that Europe is politically divided, and it's not the West. It's not just the West that matters in a civilizational sense. And why is it divided? Of course, it's had many dividing lines throughout the eras. After this Germanic conquest of Western Europe that I mentioned earlier, for example, we had the Holy Roman Empire as a main political entity in Western Europe. We had Catholicism spreading, and you have this dividing line between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. But right now, the dividing line is not that. Even though it's close to the dividing line of religion, the actual dividing line is whether or not you have American troops and American bases on your soil. So, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union, well, if you regard Nazi Germany as something evil, then I guess it is acceptable to say that the Soviet Union liberated, right, Eastern and Central Europe from the Nazi scourge. So, yeah, more than half of Western Europe, of what can be described today as the western half of the continent, more than half of that was liberated by the Soviet Union. So you have the dividing line going through Berlin and going through Germany, and well, you had Austria as an independent state, as a non-aligned state, just like you had Sweden and Finland. So you had this whole buffer zone of non-aligned countries, and then you had Italy and of course the Atlantic countries, which were part of NATO. So that was the initial dividing line, the Iron Curtain. And after the Cold War came to an end in 1991 with the breakup of the Soviet Union and with the fall of the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, the dividing line moved east just as American bases moved west. So not only did NATO not disassemble as the Warsaw Pact ceased to exist, but it rather increased its size and scope. So it advanced, it progressed westward, it progressed eastwards, and now you have this new dividing line between the American aligned Europe and the Russian aligned Europe, but it is the fault line has moved more to the east. So yeah, this is basically the geopolitics of a divided continent. The pro-American West, which takes its information and its culture and its identity from the laboratories in Hollywood and from the press agencies of the Americans. And you have the so-called non-aligned countries, which of course the Western propaganda paints as being pro-Russian, who still cater to the idea of sovereignty and oppose this kind of social engineering that comes from the West, and which will sooner or later align themselves with the BRICS countries. Serbia has already applied to become a member of the BRICS, so did Turkey. The countries that do not see their identity through an American lens will eventually team up with a multipolar world and with the institutions of this world, such as BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which Turkey is also an observing member, even though it is a member of NATO, the Western Military Alliance. So this is what I wanted to tell you today, and as always, to quote a classic, those who like what I do, you know what you can do: like, share, subscribe, leave a comment below. Thank you very much, and until next time, bye.